able to attend can get the benefits of all that we're talking about today. My name is John Colborn. I'm the Executive Director of Apprenticeships for America, and couldn't be happier than to be joining now 99 of my favorite people in apprenticeship to talk about the proposed new rules from the Department of Labor on apprenticeship. And what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through at a very high level some of the rules, talk a little bit about some of the issues that we see in the rules, talk a little bit about what we see are the prospects for the rules going forward, and then talk a little bit about what Apprenticeships for America is going to be doing during the comment period on those rules. And so just to get us started, I'm going to actually share a PowerPoint. So let me just do that right now. Great. Hopefully everyone can see a PowerPoint. And we're just going to walk through a couple of slides here. So let me just start by saying that this is the first major rule change for apprenticeship since 2008. So there's a lot of catching up that is going on in these rules. And I just want to say, if you haven't had a chance to read all 770 plus pages of the draft rules, these rules are really significant. This is not little tweaking around the edges, fixing a few things here and there. This is really a sea change for apprenticeship in the United States. Lots of new ideas, new requirements. I think it's safe to say that there isn't a single aspect of apprenticeship, registered apprenticeship in the United States that is not impacted by some of these rule changes. So lots to keep track of, lots to pay attention to. I want to call out a couple of key things, and we'll go through a much wider set of things. But first off, if you haven't seen it already, there is a whole new framework for apprenticeship in addition to sort of traditional apprenticeship, a new framework for apprenticeship called CTE apprenticeship. This is a framework for use in secondary and post-secondary education settings, and is really intended to provide an alternate apprenticeship framework in those settings. There's also a series of newly codified standards around apprenticeship, occupational standards, national program standards, and program guidelines. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but all of those are really intended to drive standardization in apprenticeship and to speed apprenticeship approval for folks that are following those guidelines. There are some new expectations for state apprenticeship agencies. So if you are in an SAA state or working in an SAA state, new expectations for those important partners in the national apprenticeship system. And then across almost every function that is involved in apprenticeship, whether it's registration or reporting, related technical instruction or related instruction now, all of these have new rules and new requirements under the proposed rules. And if you haven't had a chance to download the rules, they are available on apprenticeship.gov. You can get them there. As far as I know, and I did check this morning, they have not officially been published in the Federal Register, which just means that our comment period has not formally begun for these rules, but we expect that to happen imminently. Let me just sort of give a high-level overview to sort of what we at Apprenticeships for America are seeing in the rules. First off, I think we have to really give some credit to the department for the way that these rules are really highly responsive to feedback from the field, and they align with a lot of the perspectives and values that many of us who have been engaged in apprenticeship would espouse. And so I think we really want to acknowledge the excellent work that the department has put forward in terms of paying attention to what people are saying in the field. If there's a flip side of that, maybe a little too responsive. And so the question I think that is raised in these rules is, have we created so many new requirements, so many new innovations and opportunities that they may sort of fall under their own weight? And in particular, there's really three areas at Apprenticeships for America that we're focused on. The first is just looking overall at the burden of some of the new requirements on apprenticeship sponsors and apprenticeship intermediaries. Lots of new requirements around reporting, around operational requirements. So that raises some concerns, particularly since these are rules. There is no appropriation to go along with these rules to offset some of those new requirements. The second thing, kind of relatedly, is are there so many new requirements or expectations that are being placed on employers, either as sponsors or as employer participants in group sponsorship, that we are really undermining the opportunity to bring new employers into the apprenticeship practice. And that's a particular concern for those of us who are thinking about how we scale apprenticeship in the United States. And then finally, while many of the innovations and new thinking around apprenticeships that we're seeing here are things that many people in this very webinar would have said those are good directions for our apprenticeship system, to immediately launch towards them under a regulatory regime at scale without necessarily having done a lot of testing of those ideas raises some concerns about how will the system be able to accommodate all this new innovation, and will we be able to get to the objectives of some of these innovative practices without, again, sort of being stuck under the weight of an overarching regulatory regime. So what we have done at Apprenticeships for America, I think just about everybody on this webinar should probably have the summary that Apprenticeships for America has put forward. If you haven't received it, we'll give you an email address at the end of the webinar so that you can request one from us. Even the summary is 30 pages long, so my apologies. We couldn't get it any shorter than that. But what we tried to do is really give a very, very quick take on the proposed rule. So a little bit, you might say we've sacrificed quality to be able to get you a very quick read on these rules. Nevertheless, I think we've done a pretty decent job of giving you a flavor of what is in these rules. We've divided our report into 4 sections. So the first is talking about the standards of apprenticeship. That's the section that really deals with the sort of traditional apprenticeship and all the rules and regulations around that. The second is this new career and technical education apprenticeship framework. We've done some analysis on that. The third is to look at the National Apprenticeship System and some of the new rulemaking that would affect that system. And then finally, we felt that there were a series of definitions. There were many, many definitions in the new rules, but there were a handful of definitions that we really felt it was important that stakeholders and constituents in the field should be aware of. For each of those, for each component within those sections, we tried to provide a sort of 1 or 2 sentence snapshot, sort of what is this section trying to do, a summary of that section, and I want to give a shout out to ChatGPT, which really helped us with creating these summaries. And then finally, a brief analysis from AFA as to what we see as sort of the key questions or issues that are raised by that section. We expect to continue to provide analysis and insights around the rules as we have a little bit more time to digest them, and as we hear from members and stakeholders around the kinds of concerns and issues that you are interested in hearing in, and where our analysis might be helpful. I'm going to now just sort of walk through it again, very high level, a set of highlights around the rules. This is not in any way meant to be comprehensive. You may have a rule that you're really interested in that isn't listed here. So we're not trying to hit every single rule, but we are trying to speak to what are some of the more impactful rules that are going to speak most widely to the field. The first off is the sort of gatekeeper test around apprenticeships and their application, which is the notion of apprenticeability under the new rules now called suitability, and a set of rules that really speak to how the U.S. Department of Labor identifies occupations that are suitable for apprenticeship. And Philip, if I can just ask Philip Minardi, if you can just put yourself on mute, that would be great. Thanks. Thank you. So there are some changes there, and we think that that's a very important area for the rules to be focused on. We certainly will have some feedback on that notion of suitability. In the area of standards, you're going to see lots of changes in the way that the Department of Labor regulates the standards around apprenticeship. So you may recall in the old regime, there was competency-based, time-based, and hybrid. The Department of Labor is now really just taking on a hybrid approach to on-the-job training. There are new expectations for the number of hours in related instructional related instruction, new focus on quality of instruction, new wage rules in terms of what the apprentice should be expecting in terms of their wage progression, requirements for apprentice assessment, new rules on the journey worker to apprentice ratios, new rules on transparency, and an overall set of issues focused on, or set of rules focused on advancing the value of diversity and inclusion in apprenticeship using EEO and other mechanisms to try and make sure that our apprenticeship system is open and accessible to all Americans. In the area of registration, a whole variety of new registration requirements, some that speak to the accessibility of the program to diverse audiences, a new requirement around financial sustainability of prospective sponsors, a set of rules that relate to transparency and making sure that the apprenticeship program is fully understood by all parties. And there are some new application process requirements. So a requirement, for example, that complete applications are reviewed and given an answer within 90 days, for example. In the area of just documenting apprenticeship, changes there. So the apprentice agreement has new standards, and there's a new agreement, I think a new agreement introduced called a program standards adoption agreement, which is an agreement between a sponsor and a participating employer, and really is intended to speak to the growing number of group sponsorship apprenticeships that are underway, and a desire to make sure employers are fully aligned with that. New regimes and approaches to making sure that there's quality training available to applicants, both on the job and in related instruction. A new requirement for endpoint assessments for all apprentices, taking a page from some of our international apprenticeship colleagues. And then a requirement that every program is reviewed within 5 years, not so much a new requirement, but there are new standards applied to that requirement. So I hope this is making clear these are not minor rule changes. And we're not done. So in the standards of apprenticeship, there's also the introduction of new occupational standardization regimes, something called a National Occupation Standards for Apprenticeship, which is really intended to take some of the work that's already underway in places like the Urban Institute to create national standards around apprenticeship in particular occupations. The notion there being that if we had these sort of off-the-shelf, ready-to-go templates, sponsors who were prepared to use those templates would get expedited review of their proposal. There's a national program standards for apprenticeship, which is the idea of taking that national occupation standard and then being able to apply that for national apprenticeship. The national program standards for apprenticeship is something that that has been around but is now codified into regulation. And then finally, something new called a national guideline for apprenticeship standards, which is intended to offer to states some guidance in particular occupations where there may be a little bit of variability across the country around those occupations, but nevertheless, there would be sort of an underlying guideline that could help states with an expedited review of sponsor proposals. As I said, there's a whole new regime called the Career and Technical Education Apprenticeship. This is an apprenticeship, new apprenticeship framework, as I said, really meant to apply to secondary and post-secondary education settings. The standard for age participation remains 16 years of age, so no change there, but everything else is changed. So there is a requirement that apprenticeships that are set up under this this framework would need to be coordinated and tightly connected to state career and technical education agencies. They would be delivered through Perkins eligible institutions and programs. There's a requirement that they use something called a industry skills framework, which is really meant to be a sort of a teaching and instructional guide for apprenticeship programs, so that they are teaching to a widely understood occupational standard. There are changes in terms of the on-the-job and related instruction requirements. So these are slightly shorter apprenticeships. But there's the addition of an expectation that there would be some post-secondary educational credits, 12 to be precise, that would be part of the final deliverable to the apprentice. And it's important to note that these programs are really meant to be connective tissue and connect to non-CTE apprenticeship, perhaps with advanced standing in those apprenticeships, or further education and training, or an employment outcome. So the idea is that there wouldn't necessarily be a terminal journey worker certificate for these apprenticeships, although there could be. That could be a design. And then finally, I want to just say around the national apprenticeship system, there is quite a bit of attention focused on data and reporting. And I think this is really responsive to a general desire that the apprenticeship system should be accountable, should be understanding the direction it's going, should be able to support further research and development. And so building a data infrastructure to be able to do that. The state apprenticeship councils have new rules to guide their roles and responsibilities in the national apprenticeship system. One sort of key factor, or at least key factor for Apprenticeships for America, was noting that registration and oversight functions may not be delegated to the advisory council, but instead must be processed by the state apprenticeship staff. And so this would be a significant change in some way. In many states, many SA states, that may actually be a legislative change that needs to be put into place. That could be a very significant change to the way states administer and regulate their apprenticeship regimes. There's also some fairly defined language around reciprocity to ensure that state apprenticeship systems recognize both apprenticeships in states and also national apprenticeships. And that's certainly been an issue of concern for many Apprenticeships for America members. So we were very happy to see that. And as I noted, the implementation of these new regulations are likely to require legislative changes for at least some states. So that's something that will be on an advocacy agenda for many people as these rules work their way through. I want to just say, so that's a lot, right? And that's not even, we're not even trying to sort of address every single rule change that's in the proposed rules. We're also very, very early days in seeking to understand these rules. We think that there are going to be opportunities for a lot more analysis. And in fact, we want to be able to hear from you in just a second on what your interests or concerns might be. But for example, we think there might be some value in just doing a side-by-side comparison of CTE and non-CTE apprenticeship, just so there's clarity around what the differences between those two frameworks are. We think there's a general need for an assessment of the new requirements as they relate to sponsors and to employer partners to really try and assess the degree of burden that may be imposed here, and so we can be responsive to that concern. Similarly, we think there are operational implications for apprenticeship intermediaries and for sponsors that we need to understand better and to be able to weigh in on just how much of a burden or challenge there's going to be in that. And then we think overall there's going to be value to the department in terms of trying to establish some priorities. So if you weren't to do everything that's in the proposed rules, what would be the highest and best uses of regulatory change frameworks to be able to advance the field? And as I say, in just a second, we're going to open this up for conversation so we can hear what you're interested in or what you would like to see more of. The apprenticeship rules themselves, the prospective rules. So as I noted at the top of the presentation, I do not believe they've been published just yet in the Federal Register. That should happen imminently, and upon that date, there will be a 60-day comment period. Which will then kick off an opportunity for practitioners and employers and other stakeholders to be able to let the department know what they're thinking about these rules. And I should say the apprenticeship, the department has been clear about directing areas where they are interested in comments and feedback, but we are not limited to those areas. We can have comment and feedback on any of the proposals. Once approved, the regulations would go to the Office of Management and Budget, where there might be further changes. We would expect that at the end of the comment period, the Department of Labor will take some time to fully review comments and suggestions. Those of us who have been through these kinds of processes before know that there's generally a response from the department to every comment and suggestion that's in there. Take some time to work through that. And at the end of the day, our expectation, we think there's a couple of potential outcomes here. So the first is that the rules as a whole could be adopted, with or without change. The department may choose to adopt just a portion of the rules, again, with or without change, or they could be withdrawn. And even if enacted, we expect that there could be challenges from the SAA states. Those could be legal challenges or other kinds of challenges. We are already hearing, some negative feedback from some in Congress, so there could be congressional response to this. Bottom line is that this process is going to take some time. And so if you're thinking you have 60 days to get ready for these new rules, you can relax. It's going to be some time before we actually see the implementation of these new rules. And I should say that within the rules, the department itself has understood that there's going to need to be opportunities for transition to some of these new rules. So this isn't intended to be a scare webinar where you're suddenly going to have to be working on whole new ways of thinking about apprenticeship, but down the road, significant changes. And then finally, I just want to speak to Apprenticeships for America and our role in reviewing these rules. We are very eager to engage our members, stakeholders, and partners in a conversation about these rules. And our expectation is to use the month of January for a variety of consultations on webinars like this, maybe with a few fewer people, that would allow us to go deep on particular aspects of the rules. You can see on this slide, we're giving some suggestions of areas where we would focus, but I actually want to use this webinar to help us refine that a little bit. Also, during the month of January, we expect to be meeting with other advocacy organizations, others who are active in this field, to explore where there may be opportunities to coordinate our responses and to be able to coordinate how we do share stakeholder outreach and engagement. By the end of January, we would hope to have published a series of analyses and findings, some of which I've referred to earlier in the presentation, but others that may be responsive to your particular interests and needs. And beginning in the first week of February, we would expect to at least have a draft of AFA's recommendations or responses to some of the proposed rules. That would actually then give us an opportunity to kick off a mini campaign to work with members and partners to make sure that comments are getting into the Department of Labor and that the department is fully apprised of the field's take on these proposed rules. So that's the end of the formal presentation of this webinar, and we're now going to open this up for some conversation and reactions. Let's start, if we can, with reactions to the presentation. Then we're going to talk a little bit about areas of interest and concern. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about a process for reviewing comments and feedback. So Eric, I see you have a hand up. Let's start with you.
John, we've also keyed up some questions. So when you're ready.
Oh, great. Oh my gosh, look at that. So we'll work on the Q&A too.
Why don't you go ahead and take Eric's questions since he has his hand raised, and then I can key up some questions to you. Okay.
That's excellent. Eric.
Great overview, John. I really appreciate it. I have not taken the time to read all 700 pages yet, or even the first 10, but we'll get there.
I will tell you, it makes great fireside reading. I just suggest that. Great fireside reading.
Right. Yeah. Something to do on Christmas Eve. Just 4 quick things, and they don't need I won't take a lot of time, I promise. So if somebody from labor is on the call, I'd love to hear if there's any sense from labor, what they think of all this yet. That will be important. I also want to just suggest to folks that we just not rely on the AFAs, JFF, Urban, and those guys to respond. Each of us on this call can write our own letter. We don't have to respond to everything. We can just respond to 1 or 2 things if that's important to us, or we can respond to everything, or if people share their comments, we can borrow from them sometimes. So you can just pick one thing. The important thing to me about the CT, and it sounds like it's headed in the right direction, right? They're talking about data, they're talking about diversity, they're talking about youth. What I'm flagging here is a concern about youth because it's a really not well-defined space at the national level, and there's a lot of confusion in states and locals. The CTE project sounds great, but if you're opportunity youth, if you're 16 to 24, out of school and out of work, you're out of luck, right? And so I'm a little bit surprised they didn't address that in this, or address other youth apprenticeship things other than this CT thing. That's great if you're in a CT program, but you might not be in one or can't get in one. So I would just ask us all to take a look at what there is around youth, because I think that's the next frontier for us. And, we should give our own comments about youth, not only just whether we like and support the CTE thing, which sounds like it might be kind of cool, but also what are we going to do for all the other 16 to 24-year-olds that are seeking apprenticeship? So I'll just leave that there and then reemphasize, John, I'd love to get some of labor's take, and that, we all try to come together around some of these things. I mean, God knows, we all knows this needs to be revised. Oh, and lastly, the burden thing, right? You're laughing because I say lastly 7 times, right? The burden thing in OMB speak is really about, the burden on employers and how long it takes to fill out papers and all that. But it's also sort of an efficiency measure, right? That doesn't cost too much and it's not a huge burden to do all the paperwork. So hopefully, and you probably have more information about this, that they've talked about reducing the burden of these 671s and these apprenticeship packets that we have to submit. So I'll stop there, John, and I'll just listen in. You don't have to answer anything unless you have something brilliant to say. Thanks.
That's excellent. Thanks, Eric. And just on the Department of Labor call out, would love to have your perspective if you're on. Also understand that there will be a Department of Labor webinar of its own in the, I believe, second week in January. AFA will certainly be publicizing that. So encourage you to hear the official word from the Department of Labor.
Okay.
Marianne, should we go to Bob, or do you want to introduce a couple of questions?
Okay, Bob, just a second. That are on here. Gavin asked a question. Was there any mention of addressing the gender gap in apprenticeships, assuring equal pay?
So I would say my guess is that there's sort of 2 answers to that. So the first is overall in the across many areas of regulation, there's really a call for apprenticeship programs to pay attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to make sure that the processes, whether those are training and education processes, recruitment processes, are open and accessible to anyone who's interested in the program. And then I will say, with respect to the wage question, there are some new regulatory requirements around wages and around the wage progression within apprenticeship, namely that the last stage of wage progression can't be anything less than 75% of the journey worker's wage for that occupation. So I think in doing that, there is some effort to try and, that is not specifically a gendered response, but there's certainly some interest in the department to make sure that wages are tracking and are providing people with the kind of economic opportunity we're looking for. Sorry, can't hear you, Marianne.
How certain are you that these regulations will actually be implemented?
Yeah, as I alluded, I think there are many possible outcomes, we will need to be prepared for a variety of different possibilities, including the possibility that the entire rule set would be withdrawn. And there's some speculation, I'm just repeating what I'm hearing, this isn't any inside knowledge, that if the rules process were to span administrations and there were a change in administration, that these rules would potentially be significantly redone or withdrawn in that circumstance. So I think there's a lot of possible outcomes here. My own sense is that we should take them seriously and expect, because I think there was serious thought given to these rules.
Sure.
We should take them seriously and provide our best feedback to the department on it.
Another question is, do you feel that the CTE edition is a replacement for the youth apprenticeship?
It absolutely does not need to be, and in fact, I think I think the vision around the CTE apprenticeship is a kind of pre-apprenticeship plus or an apprenticeship light maybe, and I think the idea here is really to build on-ramps to apprenticeships, and I could certainly envision folks who are working with opportunity youth or younger age populations that want to end with a journey worker certificate to a full journey worker certificate and a fully apprenticeable occupation, that they would want to pursue this under the traditional apprenticeship area, not under the CTE area. But I will tell you, there's a lot of nuance to the CTE apprenticeship idea. As Eric said, seems like there's some really good ideas in there, and those need to be sort of brought out and fleshed out a bit.
Sure. Carla wanted to know if everyone would get a copy of the slide deck, and of course, we'll be happy to sign.
The answer is yes, of course we will, and we'll have some follow up on this in just a second.
Sure.
Yep.
Joanne asked, do you think that this announcement with the proposed regs will have any effect on registration of new occupations? Great
yeah,
question.
I think there's a couple of issues here. So one is the suitability standards that are spoken to in the regulations still require a sort of demand. It still has to be an applicant who puts themselves forward, who frankly does all the work on getting an apprenticeship ready to go, and then submits that to the department for a suitability analysis. And our take is that may not be the most efficient way to work through a suitability analysis. So we have some concerns about that. I will also say that the department has raised its concerns about what it calls the splintering of occupations, which is to say, when there's a proposal for an apprenticeship in an occupation that's similar to another occupation, there's a worry that they may be sort of a race to the bottom of finding lower pay or lower opportunity occupations. Our take on that is that the first person in an occupation shouldn't be able to say exactly how apprenticeship plays out forever and ever. And so I think we're going to have some comments on the department's take on that. And then finally, I'll just say the National Occupational Standards does create some new opportunities, however. And so I think the idea of being able to drive a process that allows for standards to be built occupation by occupation, and then to be able to use those standards to be able to move proposals through the registration process faster, and frankly with better information. That seems really promising and could be used for some of the new occupational opportunities in apprenticeship.
Sure. Another question is, has the industry skills framework been defined?
I would say there is. I should bring in Bob to talk about this. I think there are examples. There's a good example of how this might play out, which is going on right now at the Urban Institute with contracts from the Department of Labor, as they've been building out occupational standards for apprenticeship. And my sense is that that'll be a touch point for how the regulations will play out. But that's a question I would love to hear a take from the Department of Labor on, to be honest. So, Bob, why don't you jump in here? This is a great place for you to jump in.
I'm very confused by this notion that it should be an industry-based CTE apprenticeship as opposed to occupation-based. Apprenticeship around the world is always occupation-based.
Right.
I don't know what they mean by an industry-based. It's what we're doing at Urban all relate to occupational standards. And then the second thing on the CTE piece is far greater number of hours, off-job hours, and but more broadly, I mean, I'm just wondering what kind of research with employers they may or may not have done.
Yeah.
It's all well and good to want high standards for everything, but there have to be, apprenticeship has to come with an employer. Employers don't have to do registered apprenticeships. They can do unregistered apprenticeships or any other kind of training that they want to do. And there doesn't seem to be much evidence here of any notion of a trade-off between demanding more and more. I mean, for example, this 75% of a journeyman's wage. What is a journeyman's wage? I mean, there just seems to be a huge amount in here for which research seems to be lacking.
I think that, yes, I have nothing to say to that except amen. Yeah.
This isn't a question, but a comment. Operational implications for SAAs need to be added to this list, please.
So completely agree. And in fact, in some of the very early conversations that Marianne and I were having on this very topic, we were asking, who's the army of people who are suddenly going to be working at the Office of Apprenticeship and the SAAs to start managing all these new regulations? So I think there are not only just in terms of the administration of the regulations, but some of the new requirements of the regulations really do need to have an analysis for the administrators of the national system to be able to say, yes, we can do this, or this is going to be a challenge. And bear in mind, well-intentioned each one of these regulations are, in total, they create some level of stress for us to think about how that all gets taken on. And there is no new money attached to this. To Bob's point, employers can go other places if we're asking them to do a lot of new things and we're not giving them any new resources to do those things. We create disincentives around apprenticeship. So we have some challenges there to try and assess.
I see Jim Rosapep has his hand up.
Oh, great, Jim. Jump in here.
Well, yeah, a couple things. One was just if folks can identify, or Marianne can identify who's asking the questions, just because we can't see anybody, so we kind of know who's making comments. That would be helpful. That was the first reason I raised my hand. But the second point, and maybe you know the answer to this or don't know the answer to this, but I think you implied that the proposed CT apprenticeship is just another option, that it doesn't rule out school to work apprenticeship.
Right.
Okay. Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Okay, well, that's a big deal, because having more options is fine, but having less options is not fine. So that's very good news. The second thing I was going to say, and you've kind of alluded to this, and I think this is something that we ought to think about in our comments, is as they're thinking about these regulations, they should be part of a broader strategy to scale up. and not just that they ought to have the resources to do the extra work, but they ought to be able to show how is this going to help us scale up. So that was my only thought.
I love that as a frame for analysis. That's great, Jim. Thank you.
Tim Smith asked, are the rules intended to apply to the flow of new programs, or will they be retrospectively applied to the stock of already approved programs?
Yeah, great question. So there's quite a bit of language, let me say, in the rules about transitions. I think the expectation is that as programs work through their 5-year review cycle, that would be a time to start getting programs sort of all on the same regulatory framework. But there are different rules for different aspects, or different transition rules for different aspects of this rule package. For example, the state apprenticeship office changes are often are meant to be concurrent with new state apprenticeship plans, and there's a time frame for implementing those plans, or developing and submitting those plans. So the short answer is, I think the department has been reasonably thoughtful about realizing you can't just wave a wand and have everyone change. But I think the devil's in the details, and that will be certainly part of our analysis going forward.
Vince Collar says, I love the idea of side-by-side CTE and non-CTE apprenticeship. Is this something AFA is planning to undertake? And if so, do you have a timeline when this might be released?
So I think I will just tell you, because as I was reading through the regulations, I was like, geez, it'd be really handy to have the side-by-side sort of understanding of how they, and so I think that's something that we or somebody else should be taking on. And I am talking to others with an interest in the CTE apprenticeship to just see who wants to take the lead on that. It's sometime, if not somebody else, AFA will take that on in the next couple of weeks. And I will just say our objective would be to have these analytical tools done by the end of January, so they can be used in framing comments during the month of February.
Okay. Serena Wallace says, is a huge win for national programs to have reciprocity requirements for SAA states. Are there built mandates for SAA's programs to comply to this change?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. And as I was not trying to read the rules with a view of what our response was going to be. I was really just trying to understand them. But immediately I started thinking of, what are the loopholes here that we want to make sure that states can't put into place. So, for example, wouldn't we want to say that reciprocity is in all facets, right? Including, availability of state funding or the ability of a national program to be able to access state programming. So I think there's room for clarification around that, and that's certainly something we'll be thinking about as we develop some comments on the rules.
I think they said they just have to develop procedures for how they're going to do reciprocity, not that they have to actually do reciprocity.
And it may be different in different parts in the rules, Bob.
Yeah.
So because I think there were some parts that were a little bit more definitive and some parts that weren't. That's a really good observation, actually.
Andy had a very detailed set of issues regarding the endpoint assessments and particularly the national occupational standards. But at the end of the day, saying if we're not careful, people might decide that the outcome is not worth the effort.
I think that is if there's an overall frame here for these rules, I think you've just nailed it. And so, and I'll just say on the endpoint assessment, I think the department, I think, was pretty deliberately vague about the details on the endpoint assessment. I think their notion was to put a toe in that water without necessarily mandating a particular format or structure for it. So, you know, I think many of us have seen the value from the British experience about these endpoint assessments. And I will certainly want to understand more about how this plays out in the U.S. context and what that looks like.
Sherry,
Andy, it sounds like you want to jump in here. So Andy, please.
Thanks, John. Firstly, I'd say that this whole conversation has been very, very helpful. So well done to you and all of the team. And I think everybody should probably recognise the effort that's gone into the distillation that you've done. So well done. So thanks for that. I do think what I see here, but this is not the label that it's gone under, is an ambition for the future. And I think what we have to think about here is the realities, and that was what I put in my my lengthy note. So apologies for putting it in the way I did. But there's a whole load of procedural, structural work that has to happen here before you can make the whole system work. Ultimately, until you get that procedural structure in place and everybody understands the rules, there is no certainty for employers that they'll want to play in the game. Unfortunately, you've then got the counter that goes back to that says what this notification has done is put everybody on alert that actually it looks very complicated and unstable for a period of time, and actually there is the risk that they'll just go and do something else instead. So we do need DOL and others to start putting out some kind of stabilization communications around this, to let everybody know what you're doing at the moment is okay. You're going to be able to keep doing that. For apprentices, there are concerns. Hey, is this going to affect the end of my program? And for those employers that have got very well set up and high-performing programs, they're going to want some certainty that they can keep doing what they're doing if their program is actually meeting their needs. And as everybody will know who knows me, I would always say the most important individuals here are the individuals participating and the employers that are hiring them and paying them and training them. And actually, that's the contract that we need to keep focus on here, not whether we want to hit, and I'm going to talk from a UK perspective here, not whether we want to hit OECD ranking points, etc. I actually, and most employers, don't give a damn about how well we rate. If I've got the workforce with the skills I need, I'm happy. And anything we do that threatens that is problematic.
Excellent. Why don't we take one or two more questions, Marianne, and then I want to close with some process conversation.
Absolutely. Sherry Franey said, I think it is imperative to lay out a graph of stakeholders and tasks within each, as it seems that intermediaries, sponsors, and employer responsibility seems to be conflated. It also brings up concerns about co-employment.
I love that suggestion, and I'm immediately starting to think through the Excel spreadsheet that's going to help us do that. So I love that suggestion. I think that's a great way. It also sets up our ability to really understand sort of some of the burden questions. So thanks for that framing, and we'll certainly take that under advisement. That's great.
Okay. And let's see, I'm just looking for a good one to end on. And I'll just end. Does the anti-splintering rule take away from some of the apprenticeships where companies have the ability to customize to a certain extent?
You know, it could, and I think that's this is, you know, I think we all agree that we don't want to be in a place where an apprenticeship program can come in and undermine another apprenticeship program with lower wages and what have you. But I think we also have seen that sometimes this concern about splintering holds back apprenticeship from being able to really robustly enter new occupational areas. And so our challenge is to help guide the department on a way to sort of split that baby, if you will, and find an appropriate balance between those two concerns. So certainly, there, this is an area where I think people of goodwill can have different opinions, and so we're just going to acknowledge that within the field there are different perspectives on this as well. But I think our task at AFA is to try and come up with a reasoned way to be able to address both those concerns without necessarily holding back the growth of apprenticeship in the United States. So I think we'll leave it there. Apologies to Alex and to folks whose questions didn't get answered. Let me just say a couple of things about that. Number one, you should feel free to contact Mary Ann or me or anyone at AFA to let them know you've got a question or a concern, or you just want to talk to somebody about trying to understand something. Let us know of your interest. If you don't have our email addresses, go on the website, just click on the contact us. We will get back to you. That's apprenticeshipsforamerica.org. Just click on the contact us and we will get back to you. We'd love to hear from you. And maybe, Marianne, you could just put in the chat your and my email addresses so folks have access to that. And then let me also say that we're very interested in engaging stakeholders broadly through the month of January as we're collecting feedback and sharing our own analysis and getting your response to that. So if you learned of this webinar through some way other than an email from AFA, that probably means that we don't have you on our membership or mailing list. And we'd love to have you join with AFA. If you would simply go on our website, apprenticeshipsforamerica.org, click on the Contact Us button and let us know that you're interested in participating in further conversations around the rulemaking process. We will make sure you get looped into that. We promise not to spam you, well, not too much anyway, with email, and we'd love to have your participation and engagement in this process. And if I can also say, if you can, just add to your email, I'm particularly interested in X, and that'll help us target communication to you and your engagement. I want to say once again, thanks to everyone for your participation in this webinar. This is certainly not going to be the last of these. We will be sharing out the information on the Department of Labor webinar. We encourage you to participate in that, to hear directly from the Department of Labor on this. And we'll be in touch certainly after the first of the year, maybe a little bit before, with some meeting plans for the month of January so that we can continue to engage you in developing our response to these rules. Again, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day and a great holiday season and New Year. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Happy holidays.